So first, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar. For those who don't know me, my name's Chris Bach. I'm Director of FIF. I just wanted to note a couple of items before starting this roundtable discussion. Many of you on the call are active members of our 606 working group. And obviously this form of our traditional working group is a little bit different. And I just wanted to give a couple of reasons why. First of all, this is probably going to be kind of our capstone 606 working group meeting in terms of implementation of Rule 606. This is honestly a sad day for me from my perspective. I think this is the first time I've been nervous in a FIF working group call in a long time, because we really have been down a long road. And this is certainly a kind of a special implementation project for FIF. As I just stated, we really don't expect too much more in terms of additional implementation guidance from the Commission. We don't believe that there's really fundamental opaqueness from the SEC's point of view in terms of their intent, which is a deviation from what we kind of originally went through in terms of our exposure to the rule and how they were interpreting the rule set itself when it was first promulgated. This might come to a surprise to some of you, especially for those who were not part of our working group, but our rationale for that conclusion is really the purpose of that roundtable. We really want to socialize and disseminate some of the information and detail we have gained from our many internal discussions between industry subject matter experts, as well as our many discussions with the SEC on Rule 606. Just wanted to note that while this working group has spent a significant amount of time discussing the challenges associated with 606A, we will devote the majority of this discussion to 606B3. And just a couple of other items I wanted to mention. I mean, really, since the working group started in November of 2019, a significant number of industry participants have devoted just a significant number of hours of resources of time with us to really work through this rule. We really appreciate that this group, the work that we've done has been enriched by all of your expertise, and I'm frankly going to miss that. While we have six roundtable participants, over 20 have joined FIF in various meetings with the SEC, offering their time and resources to do that. And again, this rule has developed well because of all of that resource allocation. I also want to note that we really couldn't have done a lot of what we attempted to do on behalf of the industry without the Security Traders Association and our continued partnership. I just wanted to thank my friend Jim Toes, President and CEO of STA, for partnering with FIF and working so closely with us. And Jim, I'm sorry if I was being presumptive. We're definitely acquaintances at this point. And then finally, I just wanted to introduce our roundtable participants. Our roundtable is really focused on trying to get as many or as broad of an industry perspective as we possibly could. So on the roundtable, we have participants from 606 vendors, introducing brokers, executing brokers, ATSs, in one case, a combination of all three, who really do focus a large part of their day job on 606. So with that, I just want to introduce the roundtable participants and offer each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves and state why they, for lack of a better term, care about 606. So I'm going to try to go alphabetical. So Greg, if we could start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Greg Berman from Citadel. My involvement in 606 actually began quite a number of years ago, while still at the SEC, on thinking through and getting lots of feedback, mostly from asset managers and from the institutional asset management community. At Citadel, we are a reporter of 606 in a variety of different ways. We have institutional customers, so that means we have direct reporting obligations under 606 3B. We also, B3, excuse me. We also have many broker-dealer customers, And that's where the whole interchange format and the question about what does an executing broker have to deliver to an introducing broker, how do we actually make those deliverings? That's where we've spent a very significant portion of time, as I know almost pretty much everybody joining this panel has today.
Great, great. And if we could go to Ben.
Yeah, hi everyone. Ben Caliv, BXS. I basically started in this corner of the industry when the first 606 was basically coming out. So I've basically been involved in this for almost the last 20 years now. And, 606 has obviously been a huge part of what I do for a living. Spoken to many people over the years about it, and really kind of grew up in the industry with 606, 605 as well. And, continuing to work with firms to get it done.
Chris, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute. I'm sorry. Doug, I was handing off to you. I apologize.
Okay. I figured my name was next, letter C. So yeah, Doug Craig from the Fidessa division at Ion Group. We have nearly 100 U.S. broker-dealers of various shapes and sizes using our order management platform. So in terms of gathering all the underlying vendors or so for both 606A and 606B, huge focus on this for the past 18 months. Primarily before that, since the rule came about, our focus was providing data for the 605 and 606A requirements. So without exception, every customer that we have is affected by this rule. And large, obviously, as this kind of comes to market and people actually start to generate reports, it's just been a huge focus for us. We're really able to kind of streamline the way we made this data available and the formatting to hopefully make a win-win for everyone. So still living, breathing 606 on a daily basis.
Great, Mark.
I'm not usually in the latter half of a group when we're sorted alphabetically. I'm Mark Davies, CEO of S3. S3 entered the 606 space back in 2004. We've been actively reporting and active in the 606 space for a very, very long time. When the announcement came out, I realized that this was a real opportunity for growth in the industry, and took it, sort of started working with the FIF and with, most of the other panelists here, attending, I believe, every visit that we did to the SEC. And, obviously we've taken a very strong role in this because I think 606 is going to be critical to what happens over the next few years. Since I have you guys, I'm also excited to announce that S3 was just awarded the Best in Reg Tech Markets Choice Awards by Markets Media. That was just announced an hour ago. So looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Mike?
Yeah, hi, Mike Earlywine from Able Noser. How did we get into 606? In the movies, when they ask for a volunteer and everyone steps back and you're late, that's how we ended up as an expert in 606. Seriously, we echo Mark's thoughts that when we looked at the announcement and what was in the rule and where the SEC wants to take the use of this data, that's where we became interested in it. It's a big part of our Compliance Plus component, something that we are expanding and seeing a lot of adoption to. So looking forward to seeing the data come out there and getting a chance to actually take a look at it and analyze the data. That's where the real payoff for 606 is going to be for both sides of the street.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And finally, Howard, you shouldn't be last either with your last name, but please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Howard Myerson, Chief Compliance Officer for Liquidnet. in that role, one of my responsibilities is to review all new regulations, including any regulatory reporting changes, and then to communicate that to the technology group. And we are involved in trading that involves 3 levels of routing. So as we were going through the workflows with our technology group, it became apparent that there was a lot of complexity. And it's just great that we had FIF to help us, because I can't imagine how else we could have gotten, or the industry could have gotten clarification on these issues. At this point, the focus is less on interpretation, and now the focus is really on implementation, providing reports to customers, providing monthly data to our upstream brokers, and then also ensuring that we have the necessary data from our downstream brokers.
Great, thanks, Howard. We're going to get into some of the discussion topics. We have enumerated a few items that we'll run through. Hope this to be a free-flowing discussion. I'm going to hand off a couple of topics to a couple of people we've already identified, but this is going to be an interactive conversation. And then as we get into the Q&A, so to speak, we hope to get additional perspective. I'm going to start by just providing a summary level overview of where we started and how we got to where we are today. Just wanted to mention Mark is correct. He did join us at every one of the meetings. I think it was 7. John Janis from IHS Markit was the other one who joined every meeting. And Greg Berman, I think missed one because I
was 6 for 7.
He was hiking and untied to any technology, which is a good excuse. But I'm just going to get started, a quick summary level of how we got to where we are. So on November 2nd, it was a Friday night, around 9 o'clock, became aware that the adopt and release was published by the SEC. That came to us as a bit of a surprise. I think some of you might remember the initial comment period of the rule proposal in 2017. And we were certainly excited about where the SEC had landed, and we were anticipating an opportunity to provide additional feedback in the form of comment letters. That didn't happen. And we really learned that, we really didn't need to have additional notice and comment period because some of the opaqueness and some of the ambiguities in the rule became apparent very, very quickly. Really, the 2 fundamental questions that we identified at the tail end of 2018 was the concept of discretion in the context of 606b3, the triggering event for when the obligations for the introducing broker to report their customer orders in a 606b3 report would be triggered. That thankfully was cleared up relatively quickly. Pretty much everything is deemed to be discretion. We might talk about that a little bit later, but at least that fundamental question was alleviated relatively quickly. But what was not was really the scope of the obligations once the introducing broker or the customer facing broker dealer knew that they did have the obligations under 606b3. We analyzed internally, and we had a number of questions. One, was it the first route to the executing broker? That was kind of our original thought. Was it the full spectrum of the various hops the route might take before execution? Was it 2 routes? That couldn't have been the case, but we just didn't know. And frankly, after some of the discussions with the SEC, it seemed that we weren't the only ones that didn't necessarily know the answer to that question initially. As we had our first meeting with the SEC after the government shutdown at the first portion of 2019, really the first week, we were able to get on their calendar, went through the fundamental questions with 606, and it just started this really great dialogue between the industry, FIF, STA, and our industry member subject matter experts to really run through the rule. Everything from the FAQ development, which frankly was, a lot of it was done through a very long meeting with the SEC where they were able to ask questions of us. We were able to provide responses, the extension orders, a lot of the guidance that has been promulgated since the publication of the adopt and release was really performed through, I think, a mutual respect between FIF, STA, the industry participants, and trade and markets and staff led by Brett Redfern, but really at the ground floor level, Ted Venuti and John Roser, just a tremendous amount of collaboration with the industry. So we're very thankful for that. I think we're at the point now where, again, we have the rule set that we need to implement. It's just collating it all together because of the way the rule was ruled out, and frankly, some of the concepts that the SEC expects may not be clear within the guidance, and in some cases almost conflictual. So that's the topic of the discussion today, to really try to socialize some of those ambiguities, try to provide perspective of why we are currently in the place we are in terms of guidance and in terms of what we need to implement the rule by the upcoming go live dates. So with that, I'm just going to hand off the first question to Mark Davies from S3. Mark, could you just provide us with an overview of, a brief overview of 606A and in more context with 606B in terms of the enhancements, why 606 is different, especially in terms of the 606B report than legacy 606?
Sure. So I'll start off talking about the 606A. 606A is really a modern extension of the legacy 606 reporting. Most importantly, so there really are two major components that were different. The first one is that the material disclosures and that sort of information has been broken up by the destinations that you're routing to. So it's still reporting the routes that you route order flow to, but it's now broken up. You're now going to have information about the individual fees and rebates and relationship you have with all of those destinations. The second major change to it is the addition of marketability. Previously, it was grouped by market and limit, but marketability itself wasn't included. So a limit order versus a marketable limit order did not show up separately. There are also some minor shifts on how it's grouped. Previously, it was grouped by where it was listed, but now it's going to be grouped by whether it's S&P 500 or not. That's sort of the full scope of the 606A. And the SEC has been very clear that if you have any questions about the 606A that are not answered on any modern FAQs, then you can fall back to the previous FAQs for the answers to those. 606B is really where things change, specifically 606B3. The 606B3 report is a completely new concept, as I've learned from Greg at the SEC at all, because it is an obligation to provide data between two parties, neither of which is the SEC. So effectively, when requested, you as a broker-dealer are going to be obligated to provide a 606B3 report to a customer who is trading at least $6 million over the past 6 months with you in a not held fashion. This, as Chris said, probably the main topic of this webinar is going to really talk about 606B3, because it has really shifted the view of the report, and it's had a lot of ambiguities. But at the base level, really, you're going to have to show when you make a routing decision, why you made that routing decision, if you had any economic benefit for doing so, with the ultimate goal being to identify potential conflicts of interest. And over the course of this conversation, we'll get into more of the specifics of how you'll identify those and what have you.
Great, thanks, Mark. And if I could transition to Greg, Mark mentioned the ambiguities with respect to the scope of look-through. Greg, can you describe that a little bit more, and maybe perhaps where we started with the dialogue on page 72, I believe, of the adopt and release, the concept of white labeling?
Sure. So I think the challenge with ambiguities is, well, they're ambiguous. So trying to even figure out what the right questions are really took like the first 2 months of working with both this group as well as with the staff at the SEC. So I think the crux of the original issue was trying to determine if you are an introducing broker that does not actually place the final routes, let's say, to an exchange, are you or are you not obligated to provide those final routes to your customers when they ask? Or are you just supposed to say, I routed to the following executing broker, and that's pretty much as far as I got. So one of the struggles I think that we all collectively had was in the adopting release, the SEC used some terminology that didn't necessarily overlay with the way that most firms use those same terminologies. So things about white labeling, the use of discretion, even like what's a held and a not held order. Sometimes there was some ambiguity about those types of things. So the first N months was really around, are you supposed to provide look-through? And if so, under what circumstances? So we didn't even get to the point of what you would provide in terms of like the individual columns. So the way that you can think about this is, as you know, in the 606B3 report, you have a bunch of rows and you have a bunch of columns. We spent all of our time for the first 2 months just on the rows, just trying to figure out what you were supposed to list without even thinking necessarily about the data. And in the end, we were able to get some fairly good examples out, as well as some pretty clear guidance from the SEC that if you are routing to another party and there is any possible connection to how that party is routing and the fact that you routed to that party in the first place, namely to the executing broker, then the SEC basically deems that discretion. So we've not found too many instances where an introducing broker routing to an executing broker for routing purposes would be deemed to be no discretion without any look-through that's required. There's probably a couple of cases out there, but in general, I think most people take the approach of if you wake up in the morning, you have discretion because you could have chosen, I guess, not to go to work that day. So everything always has discretion in it at some level. So that was the first ambiguity that we basically got over was if you are routing to a broker dealer, you have discretion, therefore you have to provide look-through. On the other hand, if you are not routing to a broker dealer for the purposes of routing, but you are using, let's say, an executing venue, then there is no look-through requirements. And on the surface, that seems pretty straightforward. You go to NASDAQ, there's no routing, so you don't have to do any look-through. Then people raise the question, well, what if NASDAQ routes? What if just for Reg NMS purposes, you go to NASDAQ and NASDAQ has to take out the quoted ARCA? Do you need that information? Do you not need that information? And then it starts to get more complicated from there. If you don't go to NASDAQ, but you go to an ATS and that ATS routes, do you have to get those or do you not get those? If you go to another broker dealer, let's say a single dealer platform, or just a broker dealer acting in a general capacity, and you're using them as an end venue as you would NASDAQ or NYSE or ARCA, but there's routing, do you need to get those? So I think where we are today is that there's a very clear sense of when you're routing to a broker for the purpose of routing, you have to do the look-through. Where most of the ambiguities lie today is when people are now making decisions around, am I treating the venue that I'm sending orders to as an executing broker or an executing venue or a secondary routing venue, or am I treating it as a primary routing venue? And we can get into more of those details of what the implications are, but that's sort of the current state of where the remaining ambiguities are today.
Right,
So I just wanted to sort of extend on what Greg said. I think one of the things that took us a while to understand from the SEC's perspective was that when this rule was initially created, the SEC had a perception that effectively a broker had basically made one of two choices. Either a broker handled all of their own routing by themselves, which may include software from a third party, but never from another broker, or they outsourced all of their routing to a different broker. There was this idea of, and if you look in the initial release, there's this concept of white labeling, and the SEC really had this view that either you had your own or you white labeled. They didn't really come up with this concept of what the reality is, which is that it's very much a combined. You know, the world is a lot more complex, right? They saw a black and white world and defined the rule based on black or white, but as it happens, the world is, you know, infinitely many shades of gray.
Right, and that gets to our next topic, and just to expand upon Mark's point a little bit, that was part of what the struggle for the implementation piece for. There was a time where there was almost two ships passing in the night in terms of what we were telling the SEC and what the SEC was telling us. Once we kind of solidified that, we ended up understanding what they were looking for, and to help show that, we were able to get a couple of additional terms, PRV, primary routing venue, and EV, SRV, secondary routing venue. Those terms are fundamental right now, but they aren't in the adopt and release. So Doug, can you explain where those terms derive from and what they mean in terms of obtaining the look-through information and designating the look-through entity with respect to the intent of the customer-facing broker-dealer?
Sure. The FAQs make reference, and I think in some of our meetings there were multiple iterations of the kind of nomenclature, but simply put, it really, as you just said, Chris, it comes down to intent. So in the case of an introducing broker routing an order, like Greg said, almost all these orders choose a strategy, exclude a venue, any sort of routing parameter, you have exercise discretion. So in that case, you are routing that order with the expectation and the intent that that order will be routed by that executing broker further downstream. That executing broker in that instance becomes a primary routing venue on your 606B3 extract. And I think maybe one of the ambiguities, or one of the things we'll probably talk about later with the output, you are only required to fill in, I think, 3 boxes on the chart in terms of how many shares were routed and executed and things like that. If you route an order to a venue with the expectation that that venue will execute it, again, as Greg said, an exchange was always a terminal venue, an ATS where it would be executed, that is an executing venue. And then, the kind of hybrid kind of all other is if your primary routing venue routed to another broker where that order might be even further routed to a third or fourth broker, that is sort of the classification of the secondary routing venue, the SRV. So really, there are 2 categories, primary routing venue and an executing venue, secondary routing venue. I will say maybe just one more thing to kind of make clarification. In the case of a introducing broker routing shares to another broker with the expectation that most of that order will be routed again out to exchanges or ATSs to match, but maybe that executing broker internalizes some of that flow. Maybe they cross some, maybe they find the other side, maybe they match up a VWAP over the day or something like that. To the extent that any shares are internalized by that executing broker, that is literally another row specifically for those shares that were executed at that broker. So you would see a row as the primary routing venue for all the shares that were further routed, and a row for the shares that that broker internalized. The first one would be the PRV row, the second one, the executing venue row. So it gets a little complicated with some edge cases, but really to facilitate the presentation of the look-through data, they sort of had to divide in these 2 kind of categories in the rows, as Greg said.
Great, thanks, Doug. And just to level set, the current 606B3 template as published on the SEC Taxonomy's website is on slide 3 of the presentation materials. There is a number associated with net fee, aggregating net fee and execution net fee and rebate on row number or column number 6, I believe, number 7, that line should be filled in or blanked out. The SEC just has not yet got to that portion, but you have to pretend at this point that that row should be not populated.
So, Chris, just to expand a little bit on what was what Doug was just saying, we get a lot of questions from our clients on the distinction between PRV and SRV and EV. And as soon as we get a question that starts with, can you tell me the difference between a PRV and SRV and EV? And my normal answer is, well, you got to back up because there's really only 2 terms. There's not 3. So probably the biggest, the number one piece of confusion and the, which is solvable, that we generally encounter is that whereas a PRV means you are routing to somebody else basically for the purpose of them to route for you. That is why you're doing that. Of course, there's mixed cases, so they could be also executing as principal, but your intent is to send them orders so that they can route. I'm sending a VWAP order to a broker dealer so they can process an all-day VWAP order. So that's a nice clean example. When the SEC realized that there's another level down to go, the way they thought about that level was that would be the secondary level. You would start with your primary, and then the primary would in turn route. And where would they route? Well, in the SEC's parlance, they would only route to an exchange. They were routing to an end destination. Of course, we know that's a lot more complicated than that, but they viewed that as you would be routing to an executing venue, which they labeled as EV. Now, what if the primary, not the primary, what if the introducing broker also routes to an executing venue? So you can imagine here's an introducing broker that does 2 things. Sometimes they route to NASDAQ, sometimes they route to NYSE. Other times they route to another broker dealer who then routes to NASDAQ or NYSE, or even yet another broker dealer. So where the confusion started was the SEC bundled that into one construct. So if you route to a venue for the purpose of execution, as Doug said, then you label that as an EV/SRV, one word. If you are doing look-through reporting and the executing broker routed to NASDAQ, then that line item shows up as an EV/SRV, one word. If instead your executing broker routed to another broker, then that line item shows up, one word, EV/SRV. So EV/SRV, just think about that as a string of arbitrary letters that reflects any routing that is either done because you are going to the venue directly for execution, or it's a look-through. And
Greg,
it's very overloaded, and I think that probably is the single largest cause of confusion that I've heard.
Greg, and just to take it even probably a step even further or more high level, we have very clear cases where the destination is a PRV. Simply the destination will not execute an order, agency only, for example. But there's some cases where, as you said, the intent might have been for the broker to further route, but they executed a portion principally. Would there ever be a case where the introducing broker should, in any circumstances, almost look back into what the ultimate decision of, or what happened at the PRV level and change that designation kind of post the post event? So in other words, does the intent at the time of the route govern, or would there ever be a need to change that designation to try to meet compliance standards with the SEC?
It's a good question. I think each firm is going to have to obviously make their own call and work with their own legal counsel and compliance officers on how they want to characterize. But in general, creating a process to determine how that characterization works and then applying it uniformly is usually the strongest, sorry about that, phone's ringing, is usually the strongest defense against an examination or questions about why you made those choices. Most firms, so I think it would be quite difficult, if not impossible, for firms to determine whether something was a PRV or an EV SRV based on what happened with the order. And that does not seem to be the spirit of 606, because it's really around conflicts and trying to understand how you are routing. So you made the decision to route. Why did you make the decision to route? Were you looking for the other party to be an executing venue? If so, you label them as an EV-SRV. If you were primarily looking for the party to fill the orders by routing, so you're sending them a not held order, a VWAP order, TWAP order, then you're really using them as a routing broker. To the extent that that firm also fills as principal, that doesn't take away from the fact that you are still using them as a routing broker. If, on the other hand, you have a firm that you label, we always use this firm as a routing broker, and then at the end of the year, you're working with compliance, you say, you know, they actually principally fill 99.99%, and I think they've only ever routed 13 shares, then you probably need to rethink your relationship on with that firm with regard to how you're classifying. Don't change the relationship with the firm. You have to think whether or not you need to reclassify that. But I wouldn't necessarily do it on an order-by-order basis.
Yeah, and I want to jump in on a bit on that, because you said, would they ever need to? And you know, the thought of only the SIF deal in absolutes comes to mind. But the answer to your question is really that, you know, as Greg said, the intent at the time of order routing is what matters. And I wanted to expand also on something that Doug said, which is if you route to a destination with the intent that they further route and then they fill, while it is correct that you will see two rows, you will see a PRV row and you will see an EV SRV row, all of the volume that shows up in that EV SRV row will also show up in that PRV row, because your initial route to that destination was with the intent that they routed. They then chose to fill internally, which therefore shows up as an EV SRV. So it will be indistinguishable. The fact that, you know, you routed to Citadel and Citadel routed to their internalization desk is indistinguishable from the reporting perspective than if they routed it to NYSE. They will simply show up as two rows. One of them will be another Citadel row, but it is important to understand that you're not retrospectively changing that one of those is now an EV-SRV because they internalized it. You're simply adding on to the PRV because they internalized it.
Really good point, really good point.
Right, and
Chris, if I could say one thing, I like to think of the EV-SRV as an or, meaning either that entity is an execution venue or they're a secondary routing venue, because we have scenarios that involve 3 levels of routing. That third level broker, they're being used for connectivity to the exchange, so they're not executing. They're just a routing broker. They're not an executing broker, but they would be recorded on the report as an EV SRV, even though they're not an executing broker.
Correct.
right.
And in fact, in that case, Howard, you would never see the executing broker because there's only two levels down, correct?
Yes.
In other words, from the perspective of the first broker, right, they route to the second broker, they route to the third broker, you would not see the route from the third broker to the exchange.
Yeah.
Right, so if an introducing broker routes to LiquidNet, routes to Citadel, routes to New York Stock Exchange, then the introducing broker's report will show LiquidNet, it will show Citadel, but it will not show NYSE, even though that was the ultimate execution.
Correct.
Right, it will also not show the fees, the exchange fees for that trade.
Right.
Correct. And everything that was just said over the past 5 minutes in terms of how the PRV, EV, SRV concept is designated, it's not necessarily intuitive at all. But everything that was just said is, from my perspective, is correct. And that's really kind of the heart of why we want to have this discussion. We confirm that and confirm that and confirm that with the SEC in in-person meetings, and they understand that. It's one of those, kind of almost kind of perverse sort of rule constructs that if they're going to go two routes, they probably should have gone all the way, but we stopped at two. And to all the points that were just made, it creates a lot of ambiguity.
And to extend on that, Chris, one of the funny things that we found was that by making it two, it actually makes it harder on us as the industry, because if they did it all the way, then the reporting is the same regardless. But because they added on, because they restricted it to only two levels, we now have to know what level each broker is in the chain. Am I the introducing broker? Am I the PRV? Am I the SRV? Or am I, completely out of the chain? Am I past the, past the point of reporting, sort of point of no return?
So that transitions to a next topic. I'm going to revise kind of our agenda just a little bit. We had a question teed up to Howard on just the implication of the FAQs. I'm going to skip that for now because we do want to provide opportunities for the non-roundtable participants to ask questions and make statements during the tail end. So there's more than two fundamental, but for right now, there's two fundamental issues that I want to discuss. One is challenges related to what Mark just said in terms of obtain and look through, appropriately obtain and look through information. The other would be some ambiguities around some of the concepts related to fee and rebates. Associated with that would be the fact that a lot of the fee and rebate information is on exchange invoices that aren't necessarily parsable. So we do want to talk about that. So just in terms of the data component, I want to hand off to Ben to start. You're a vendor supporting many broker-dealers' obligation with 606. In terms of your relationship with your broker and their relationship with their counterparties, what are the issues that you see in terms of getting that downstream look-through information from your client's executing broker counterparty?
Well, we've encountered a few things. Obviously data concerns, from the simplest things like not having access to original order IDs, not being able to match off the data correctly, or correctly populate either a data file or an interchange format. Also, just working with our clients to understand, working with the broker to understand their routing patterns and how they do business to determine, okay, what levels of data do we have to get? Mm-hmm. That's really been the challenge. A lot of conversation and long phone calls and analysis of, okay, how are these brokers actually conducting business, and what data is available and where can we get it?
Great. And it's one of the issues with this rule is ultimately a non-regulated, for the purpose of 606, broker-dealer, because 606 will only apply to the customer-facing broker-dealer, is that the executing broker in many cases would be not required, but expected to provide the look-through information. That's poses the number of issues. One is it could be costly. Number two, it could be it could expose certain proprietary information. So if I could just hand off to Mike Earlywine to start, what types of conversations have you had with executing brokers to really try to communicate the need for them to provide this look-through information when they are not obligated to under the rule?
I'll actually start off by saying one of the interesting difficulties we've seen is that within the broker-dealer community and some of our clients, the people who day in and day out handle fee, rebate, exchange are in like a COO office, as opposed to a trading desk or part of the day-to-day regulatory framework of a firm. So you have people who are not used to dealing with these type of regulations, who don't really understand them. It's not really what they do. And, they're trying to fax me 6 months worth of exchange fees, right? That kind of thing. So that was the first hurdle. was who within the firm owns that data? How do they get it? How do they consume it? What do they do with it? You know, you'd be surprised in this day and age how much of that data just ends up, you know, in the bottom drawer and it's worried about later. So part of it was getting the right department. Part of it was getting people to understand the importance of it. In terms of getting someone who's not legally obligated, the truth is I think the industry's done a very good job and should be commended for its ability to work together. People understand their clients and the bind that puts their clients in. We have not seen, at least within our client base, we have not seen a lot of, you know, simple no's. We've seen a lot of, I don't understand what you're asking for, but if you could walk me through it, you know, we'll give it to you. So in that sense, you know, I think we've come a long way in the industry. People have really gone about helping out and treating, you know, the executing brokers are treating the IBs like their clients, like they should. And so that's been really encouraging. The complication really has been in helping the executing broker understand what it is they're really being asked for. The second complication has been the number of people we run across that don't realize they're an executing broker. Maybe it's a small part of what they do. Maybe it's a small division. Maybe it's a desk that doesn't sit in the main office. Maybe it's an arrangement that happened, you know, years ago, and it never really touches any human hands. It goes straight to the marketplace. And when our clients start walking through the process, they realize that, you know, we got to find a way to get that information. I'll tell you the one thing that, you know, to follow that theme, the FIF being able to say there's an interchange format. We're going to send it to you. Just fill this out. This is what you have to do. For those, you know, brokers who have a small exposure to it, it's been really helpful because now it's something they can sink their teeth into, and they're not trying to understand the whole rule top to bottom over 6 months the way the rest of us had to do. So, you know, some of the obstacles were not what I thought they would be. That's for sure.
Right, and Mark, this is a good transition. Just take 3 minutes and just describe the functionality and the intent, utility of the 606 interchange and where it is in the industry in terms of the socialization of that schema.
Sure. So when this concept of requiring executing brokers to share their fees, their rebates, their routing details with introducing brokers came out, we were trying to figure out how we could do this without too much information leakage. So we talked to several of our clients. We talked to many of our clients, many of the large brokers, many of the large executing brokers. And we sort of tried to figure out what the best way was to really disclose what they needed to disclose without disclosing too much. And that's where we came up with this interchange format, which we presented to the industry as a standard, which basically allows the executing broker to provide all of the information needed to the introducing broker without disclosing a lot of the special sauce, sort of the magic, the details that make their routing strategy different from other firms, while also making it so the introducing broker doesn't have to share proprietary information with the executing broker. So we came to this sort of middle ground of how do we ensure that both parties can get the data they need and provide the data they need with as little adverse effects as possible. Once we came out with the sort of data set that was needed, it was clear that the key was to really provide all of the information needed by the 606 regulations in a format that was aggregated to a level that did not share which customer it was for. And so that's where the interchange was born, was basically aggregating it to the parent ID from the destination, from the executing broker, all of the details by that parent ID. And then the final step in sort of coming up with that was, well, what format do we want this to be in? And what we recognized was that there's already a very well-defined format of what 606b3 has to be, which is, of course, the XML spec itself. And so what we did was we incorporated the SEC 606 spec. We added a few layers on top of that to break it down by parent order ID, to break it down by the two brokers involved in the transaction. And then that way it will always be in sync with the SEC. If the SEC updates the spec, then the interchange by its very definition will maintain that spec and will always be up to date. So the interchange really allows firms to communicate the information needed with as little sort of additional work as possible, as well as minimizing the information leakage.
Great. We are running up close to 4 o'clock. We're going to 4:15, but 4 o'clock is always a funny time. I want to hit one question very briefly, because again, it's a fundamental question before starting the Q&A session. And apologies for kind of abbreviating some of this. Greg, I'm going to ask you this question. The application of FAQ 503 and designating the PRV and the EV SRV in terms of the fee and rebate information on the 606B3 report, how would you, what's our interpretation, or what's your interpretation of whether commissions are at the PRV level, whether commissions are at the EV/SRV level, combined with the execution fee? Can you describe kind of where we've landed on that concept?
Sure. So there was a lot of back and forth on this, and I think the key is we wanted to land someplace where it was somewhat unambiguous in terms of what you do. Whether or not that's optimal from a client, ultimately from a customer standpoint, is one question, and it's always difficult to figure out how clients could really interpret this. But I think the way we landed was, if you have an economic relationship between you and your PR and your introducing broker and your executing broker, let's just say it's commissions. You pay a fixed fee per share. That's the number that goes into that row. So when you show, here's my executing broker, you put the commissions per share in to the fee column. Let's assume that that executing broker then routes exclusively to exchanges, just to make it easy. The executing broker may or may not get rebates and pay fees depending on where the executing broker goes. So when you report the EV/SRV row, you didn't do that routing, but that's the information that you're going to get from that executing broker. That executing broker should be filling those fields in with the fees and rebates netted that it got when it routed out. Now it leads to the question of, what if it passes those fees and rebates back to the introducing broker? And I think, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think where we landed was that's not considered. So if the fees and rebates are passed through, they do not alter the first row that shows the fees between the introducing broker and the executing broker. So there's no way of knowing from the report whether or not they get passed through. So we exclude them. I hope I answered that one right.
I think so, Greg. I mean, go ahead, Mark.
I agree with Greg's response there. And it was the SEC sort of the way they've responded to that is that the pass-through information is available in the EV/SRV rows, and therefore it's not going to be included in the PRV row effectively.
And this is really important, at least, so not from a technical standpoint, but it's going to be very important when you actually give these reports to your customers. When they ask questions, if they look at the report and they see in the EV rows that you as an introducing broker may have nothing to do with, if they see a lot of rebates, they're going to say, why are you routing here? Are you conflicted? One answer could be, that's not our money. We don't get any of that. It's on the report, but it has absolutely nothing to do with us as the introducing broker. It could also be, yes, we all of that is passed through to us. So you cannot tell from the report, which means that apart from all of the issues around how do we get the data, et cetera, you're going to want to have folks at your firms that are really well versed in the sort of the economics behind these reports. So when you start to give them out to customers, you're in a good position to answer a lot of those questions, which ultimately is the purpose of the report.
Great, thanks, Mark and Greg. And just to add, having offline discussions with SEC staff and going through this concept, it was almost crystal clear. That's exactly what they're looking for in terms of that bifurcation, essentially adding those numbers together and getting kind of the full fee that the introducing broker paid by adding the 2 columns up. We have 17 minutes left until 4:15. I want to transition and apologize to the panelists for not getting to some of the topics that we considered, but I think some of them might be included in some of the questions. So at this point, for participants to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. Kevin from the program office will identify you, and you can feel free to ask a question, make a statement, really say anything that you would like. So with that, Kevin, is there any questions queued up?
Not at the moment. We did have a raised hand, but they lowered their hand. So again, go ahead and find that raise hand function, everybody. And if you have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand and I will unmute you.
There is also a question on the chat, which
we do. Oh, sorry, it keeps going away. Let me find.
We have the question, Mark. You have the question, right?
Yeah. Basically, it says, do you see a merging of the look-through schema proposed by the SEC versus the FIF? And so I don't think the SEC has specifically proposed a look-through schema, but the schema that we came up with, as the FIF, it is based on the SEC's schema of the 606b3. And I believe Chris can confirm this, that we have sent that to the SEC, so they do know that that is how we are intending to communicate within the industry.
They do. They
Okay.
do. And they appreciate and respect that that's the construct that the industry has gone with. Kevin, is there a question queued up?
There was. Mike Post, I'm allowing you to speak here. I'll unmute you.
There we go.
It wasn't allowing me to unmute Mike. So Mike, I moved you up as a panelist, so you should be able to talk if your line is unmuted.
Mike, are you there?
Not hearing Mike.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question from David Connor. I'm going to allow them to talk.
Okay,
all right, David, you are unmuted.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes,
We can.
Okay, that's great. So this is Dave Connor from Verisk Financial. I'm just curious, Mark or Mike, if there's any kind of precedent for clients asking brokers proactively for the 606b3 data, if there is some sort of a precedent set where brokers will be allowed or authorized to send that data out to vendors, or will that data have to be sent directly to the buy-side firm and then have that send it out to the vendors? I'm just curious if you've had any discussions with that kind of a workflow.
We've had a couple of buy-side people say, hey, listen, I'm going to want you to copy such and such a vendor with my B3 reports, that kind of thing. But mostly what we're seeing is buy-side saying, hey, I'm gonna dump my B3 back to you at such and such a frequency, or we're hard at work at coming up with reports and statistical analysis of the actual B3 report to put some context to it relative to TCA. Among other issues with B3 is the fact that there's very little context. Just because you have a rebate or show a rebate on a certain line doesn't mean it's a bad trade, doesn't mean it's a good trade either. There is no concept of efficient execution analysis in these B3s. So As I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of work to do once firms start receiving their B3s, but I don't know that anyone is specifically targeting one vendor or another for the as a destination.
Yeah, I'll mirror what Mike said. Basically, the sort of the value of the 606B3s is going to come when we integrate it with their TCA reporting. Although I have not had specific sort of requests to go to, to CC a vendor, send to a vendor. Certainly, I think right now the focus is still much more on the sell side, where the sell side's trying to get the interchange sort of stabilized and make sure that the vendors are working together. We've seen a lot more of that, and less currently of the buy side specific request to work directly with the vendor.
Right. I agree with that. Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mike, I do agree with you and Mark that once that data does land in the buy side shop, it will be critical to be able to mirror that or marry that data to the TCA analysis, looking at the order routing details in order to make sense of it. So if this SEC data does start to provide clues into things you might want to ask sell-side brokers, marrying that to the TCA data, it's going to be an evolving partnership for sure. And I appreciate your commentary there, guys. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. I have a question. We really have two questions around the interchange schema. One is the XSD file where you can download it. It is linked to the presentation materials under the reference materials. It's the 606 interchange XSD. It's also available on S3's website. It's available on FIF's website under tools. If you need the XSD file, feel free to reach out to any of us and we can send that to you.
Yeah, and I just put it on the chat. I put the S3 URL on the chat as well to get it, and that has both the PDF description of it as well as the XSD file.
Great, thanks, Mark. I have a question from Guy from. Excuse me, I'm just reading that. Question is, curious as what appetite across the industry for requesting 606B3 look-through reports. Do firms think institutional customers, i.e. the buy side, are interested, excited to get full disclosure of their orders? How will the report be used? That's a great question. I have my thoughts, but I'm not going to share them. I'm going to hand off to whoever wants to take that question.
I guess I'm always willing to jump in. So I think to understand what the buy side will actually do with this, you need to refer back to what the SEC's original understanding was. And so the look-through component really sources back to this concept that the SEC believed, which is that there's only two possibilities. Either you handle your routing or you have a white labeled solution. And so that's really how this look-through piece came into being. And in that case, it's very clear that if you have a front on your broker dealer, if you have a website that has a, it doesn't actually do anything, it's merely a website, and you're passing everything off to another broker, then it's very clear that the buy side is not going to be so interested in what you did, because all you did was pass it to that broker. They're going to be interested in what was going on. And so I think it's really important to understand that that part, it's going to be very valuable for the buy side because they're going to see the real routing decision. As for what it has evolved into, I think I'm skeptical, honestly, of the value that the buy side is going to be able to glean, because a lot of the information has been obfuscated. A lot of the real decision making has been obfuscated because of the way the format has evolved. Now, my hope is that over the next year or so, the buy side starts absorbing these reports, starts looking at them, starts understanding and asking questions. And from there, basically, that either, certainly it will make it back to the industry, but on top of that, it makes it back to the SEC to say, this needs to be changed in this manner to become more valuable. If we add, this is how the 606B3 report needs to be adjusted to really become valuable to get us the information we need to see.
Yeah, I would agree with most of that. I think there's also going to be some value in adding data to the raw data. If you get 10 or 15 of these reports, you combine them and then add additional data to it. I think you're going to be able to have a much more interesting report. On their own, we've kind of described it as a data dump with no context, and then adding data to that, combining the data across different brokers is where it's going to start getting interesting. We've done some preliminary examinations, and it's amazing how quickly certain brokers jump out as being on, one tail end of a customer's order control, right? How across 5 brokers their orders get handled, and there's over and over been one broker who does it quite different, not necessarily wrong, but dramatically different in the way that the other group does. So there is going to be some initial insight, but I think it's going to be the buy side's going to have a lot more work to do to make them useful.
There's 2 fundamental concepts to that question that I just want to get out there. One is the SEC in several of our meetings made it absolutely clear that they expect the buy side customers to request these reports. I would suspect that they might be looking relatively quickly into whether the buy side, whether asset managers have requested reports as part of their best execution. Internal policies and procedures. And then number 2, I think Mark knows this probably as much as anyone. It's really the conversation around what the report means. As we went through kind of the ambiguities, was the report is intended to start a conversation between the introducing broker and their customer, which I think it will. In terms of the full functionality of a 606b3 report, there's obviously a lot to be desired. There's a lot of asset managers who get much better information, but especially for firms who are buy-side entities that may not have access to this data, it certainly will start a conversation. And again, that's what the SEC has said many, many times as being the effect of the rule. Would you agree with that, panelists?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
if you look at,
start a conversation. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you look at some of the news that came out yesterday about trade book, that's the kind of thing that the average, not the guy who has 5 TCA analysts on house, but the medium-sized asset manager would have had no access to figure that out. But these kind of B3 reports, theoretically, it would have been a quick look to realize what was going on. So, there may be a short-term advantage and a longer-term evolution.
Yeah, I think we had a question from. Didn't that go? I think we had a question from Frank Grampone. Frank, do you have a question?
Yes, Chris, can you hear me?
I can.
Well, actually, it's not so much a question. I know you wanted to sort of end this as the final topic, time permitting, and speak to some of the challenges moving forward with respect to 606. And this may be going in a slightly different direction, but it certainly shouldn't be overlooked, and maybe this requires an entirely separate call. But that is the regulatory obligation moving forward. Back in January, FINRA, in their annual letter to members, described the areas of focus for the 2020 examination programs. And one of the main areas of focus this year is Rule 606 reporting, as they intend to initiate a program to review firms' compliance with the disclosure of order routing information under the new amendments. So what FINRA it will look to is to ensure that firms are first and foremost using the required layout and format. They want to know that you're continuing to work closely with the downstream brokers and market venues. And I say continue because this should always remain a fluid process, as routing venues often change, as does technology, rebate and fee arrangements as well. Firms should continue to engage their counterparties to discuss the required look-through data And, they made it very clear, obviously, that in order to remain compliant, one can only trade with venues that provide the downstream data. And firms will need to develop these policies and procedures to address the accuracy and timeliness of reporting. And lastly, they'll look to see how you've now incorporated Rule 606 in your quarterly best X reviews under FINRA Rule 5310. With all this information at your fingertips, how does this now factor into your routing decisions? In particular, if you're sending order flow to firms paying rebates, as it certainly can be perceived as a conflict of interest. With the legacy Rule 606, you were compliant simply with a 1 or 2 line disclosure of rebates noted in material aspects of the relationship, simply stating that you received payment. Now with 606A, B3, rebates are fully transparent. So expect that to come under some scrutiny moving forward. Of course, this also comes at a time after the introduction of zero fee commissions by broker-dealers back in October, where there was already a thought process in place that firms may be routing to certain market centers paying high rebates, thus to offset the zero commissions. So FINRA will be looking at any discernible changes to those fully disclosed rebates, and if your routing behaviors have changed as a result. So, these are challenges of reviewing oversight, remaining updated in your reporting will remain and go well beyond the reporting dates of May 29th, June 1st, and the others for that matter.
Great, thank you, Frank. And yeah, as you mentioned, the SEC is certainly believes that this is going to be, an iterative rollout. I think they understand that there's going to be a little bit of pain in the beginning. It will be settled as the buy side begins to ask questions, and some of the challenges with the report itself will be socialized, and hopefully we get a more kind of consistent, streamlined reporting process. To your point, Frank, FINRA has certainly made that part of their priorities in their 2020 letter. I think it remains to be seen of what that looks like. I think it's going to be clear that the expectation at the buy side level will be they request these reports. In terms of how prescriptive they are, especially given some of the world events, that should be interesting in the months to come. Great, so we're 1 minute over. Now I just want to offer an opportunity for any of the panelists to mention anything else that they would like that we haven't got to yet.
Yeah, so Chris, I think probably the most important thing, maybe it was the thing that we left for last, is just to offer you a heartfelt thanks, both to you, the staff of the FIF, and the whole FIF community. This is and was and continues to be a remarkable project. I do not know how this would have worked without the FIF and without your leadership in this. You have this very bizarre construct of a rule that doesn't apply, that yet we all have to comply with. So I'm really talking about all the look-through component. And the SEC was pretty clear. They said, go figure it out for yourself. You're the industry, you're pretty smart, go figure out what you're supposed to do. And we went back and they said, no, really, we really mean it. Go figure that out. And that's not an easy task. It's not only not an easy task, but it's also very hard to get people at your firm or any firm to pay attention to a rule that doesn't apply to you. So I think it's the folks on this phone. We started with 250 people. We've gone close to an hour and a half. We have 143 people on the phone after an hour and a half talking about PRVs and SRVs. That's a lot of minutia for the interest. But it's there, and again, without drawing on too much more, thank you very much.
Thank you for mentioning that. I mean, it was a fun project. Like I said in the beginning, this is the first time I've been nervous on an FIF call in at least 4 years, just because I'm going to miss this project. think I told everyone on the screen right now this, but when the SEC basically said we're done with 606, we're going to move on to the next project. That was tough to hear, just because everyone as part of our working group spent so much time and effort. And again, thank you and thank everyone who took the time, effort, money to really get the industry to a good place in 606.
Well, you can always fall back on Consolidated Audit Trail. That'll be around much longer.
Yeah, you took the air out of the balloon there, Greg, with that cat. But thank you very much. And just to end, we are going to offer kind of a post webinar video. You can go back and kind of go through some of the nuances. I think specifically anything that has come up, especially if you haven't been close to this process and you have questions, want perspective, why we've come to some of the conclusions we've come to, most of which have been formed by the SEC staff, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to have a conversation with you. But with that, I just want to thank, again, the panelists for taking the time today throughout this whole journey, as well as anyone who remains on the call who contributed to this effort. It was a really fun and sometimes tiring journey, but I think we got to a very nice place. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Chris.
Have a great day.
Great job.
Thanks.